Tick prevention in dogs. Today we're under a major threat from tick-borne diseases and illnesses that you or your dog could get from a tick bite. So I've done all the research for you. You won't have to look any further after this video. I'm going to talk about what ticks are, how they operate, the main ticks you need to be aware of based on their environment and your environment. I'm going to talk about all of the solutions that we currently have to prevent ticks in our dogs. Orals, topicals, collars, and if you live out on a property or in a neighborhood, I'll talk about some preventative measures you can take to prevent ticks from fostering up in your area. So let's get right into it. First, let's talk about tick biology. The way that ticks can detect you're actually coming, they have a heat-seeking radar built into their system. They can see you coming as you're approaching their area. They also can detect CO2 as you're walking and breathing. Ticks prefer to set up their ambush site into tall grass, leaf litter, or brush transitions. So be very careful as you're approaching these areas and think about the possibility of a tick being there. Ticks will essentially hang off the side of a long piece of grass, and as you walk by and brush up against that grass, they'll grab onto you, they'll grab onto your dog, and they'll position themselves for that perfect bite. Now that we understand their biology in a rough sense, let's talk about the 4 primary tick threats. The first one is the black-legged tick, also known as a deer tick. This tick kind of looks like a poppy seed, and it's the most well-known to carry Lyme disease. The main issue with Lyme disease is that it can create lameness, joint swelling, kidney swelling, and it can be a career killer for a working dog. Our next biggest tick threat is the Lone Star tick. This tick is known to carry the alpha-gal syndrome. Alpha-gal syndrome creates a meat allergy in humans, especially red meat. It can be permanent and life-changing. Can you imagine not having steak the rest of your life? The third highest tick threat is the American dog tick. It's known for carrying Rocky Mountain fever. It is the largest of all the ticks and more easily to spot as you're walking along. And the final high-threat tick species is going to be the Asian longhorn tick. Now this tick is unique because it can self-clone. It doesn't need a mate to reproduce, which is crazy. It can blood drain livestock and small dogs by itself. This tick is very dangerous and has a expanding range as we speak. Now that we've talked about the tick's biology and our main threats, let's talk about our preventative measures. Now, when we're talking about dogs, we're gonna have a couple of preventions that we're talking about. We're gonna talk about topicals, we're gonna talk about collars, and we're gonna talk about orals. Now, when I start talking about orals, stick with me because after I discuss orals, we're gonna talk about the safety parameters and what we know from the science of oral prevention. All right, let's talk about tick preventatives. First, we'll start with topicals. There's 2 main types of topicals that we should be aware of. One is permethrin-based, and permethrin-based topicals, you put them onto your dog, they get absorbed into the coat, and what it does is it actually prevents the tick from being able to even attach to your dog. Basically, the tick absorbs the permethrin and falls off your dog. The pro to this is that it also will affect mosquitoes and biting flies as well. The next topical is Fipronil. Now, Fipronil works, it coats your dog's skin and coat. However, it does not affect the tick until it actually bites your dog. So it is completely normal to still see ticks crawling over your dog, and it doesn't really repel them. It will affect them after they already make that bite into your dog. There is another type of topical that we should discuss. It's the Bravecto topical. However, this doesn't work like the other topicals. Bravecto is actually going to be absorbed into your dog's bloodstream, so it actually works more like an oral than a topical preventative. So before we move on to the collars, first let's talk real quick about pros and cons of topicals. Overall, they're going to work really well for moderate exposure. If you're in a heavy exposure environment, it may or may not provide a lot of benefit to you. One con to topicals is water exposure and submersion. So you should always put on your topical 48 to 72 hours before you're going to be in any type of water or rain or wet environment. This is going to ensure the topical has as much absorption as possible before the wash off. With that being said, if you're using topicals and your dog's in water a lot, it might not be the best solution for you. Final notes about topicals. First of all, big red flag. If you have cats, do not use permethrin around them. It's completely fatal to cats, even in indirect contact. So if you have cats in your household or cats around, don't use permethrin as your topical. One other note, you will need to make sure that when you're applying your topical, you put it between your dog's shoulder blades. You don't want it in an area that your dog can lick the topical off, because if your dog licks it and ingests it, it will go more systemic, and it can be more effective systemically, but that compound was actually designed to be topically applied to your dog. All right, next up, let's talk about tick collars. These are the special collars that you see where you put them on your dog's neck and apparently they prevent tick bites, but that's not actually how they work. What they do is they'll actually make contact with your dog's skin. There will be some absorption through the skin, but what these collars are actually attempting to do is, as your dog's moving through the brush and they get a tick on them, remember that tick is waiting for the host to walk by, gets a hold of them, starts crawling around. That tick collar is going to prevent the tick from actually crawling up on the dog's head and keep them lower on the body. Now, with that being said, there are some real risks when it comes to tick collars. First of all, if you have a hunting dog or a dog that's outside a lot, this is a real snag hazard. Make sure that if your dog is moving through heavy brush or thick undercover, that their tick collar is snug up against the neck to prevent a hazard of getting hooked onto something. So if you're using a working dog in thick brush, you got to think about that for sure. All right, so let's talk about orals real quick. Oral tick prevention. Now this is a big hot topic, and I'll cover more of the science that I delved into in a deep dive here in just a few seconds after we cover a few more things. Oral preventions, the way that they work, you give it to your dog on a routine basis. It could be every month or every 3 months. Your dog ingests that oral, and what it does is has an active internal protection in your dog's bloodstream systemically. It does not prevent the tick from biting your dog. So you give your dog the oral. When that tick bites your dog and begins feeding, it takes that oral prevention into the tick's systemic body, and then that tick's gonna die and fall off your dog. But because of the 24 to 48 hour rule, that's how long it takes for a tick to transmit a disease to a host, you still wanna do daily checks on your dog, especially if you're moving through heavy brush areas, even if they're on an oral preventative. Now, before we cover the science behind oral preventatives and seizures and the potential links there between dogs and their oral preventatives, first I want to talk about the new innovations in injectable tick preventions. So Bravecto has now released a brand new injectable tick prevention. It's called the Bravecto Quantum. It's a 12-month injectable. Does the Bravecto Quantum actually last for a full 12 months? Yes, it does. It operates the same way as an oral, it just lasts longer. The tick still has to bite your dog, and when it bites your dog and begins feeding, then it ingests the compound, which kills the tick and it falls off. All right, now let's talk about oral chews and safety. You guys have read the posts, you've read the forums, you might have even heard of Project Jake. If you haven't, Project Jake was a self-reported study that was done where a number of pet owners were reporting issues they were having with oral chews. The only issue with Project Jake is that it was a self-reported study. That means that people who were affected by the preventatives were most likely to actually report something, and people that were not affected by the preventatives did not report anything. Nonetheless, the information is still out there and it raises a lot of alarms. The FDA did release an update for labels pertaining to the preventatives and neurological events that occurred potentially because of them. Now, it is important to note that the FDA issued a label update and not a recall. So the FDA is trying to be transparent in potential outcomes that could have happened due to the oral preventatives from a neurological standpoint. Adverse neurological events came in at under 1 in 10,000 doses administered in dogs without pre-existing conditions. Dogs that react typically have blood-brain barrier compromise, pre-existing neurological disorders, or the MDR1 gene mutation. Basically, what an MDR1 gene mutation does is it impacts the body's blood-brain barrier. It allows more drug to potentially enter the brain and affect the central nervous system than a dog that does not have the MDR1 gene mutation. You can test your dog to see if your dog has this gene mutation. You can request it from your local vet or local specialty vet. Just ask them to test your dog for the MDR1 gene mutation. So how do you decide which preventative is right for you? You're going to need to look at your exposure risk. You're going to need to look at what types of environments you're typically in. You're going to need to look at the tick risk in your area. Take all of this into account and also loop in your vet. Talk to your vet, figure out your dog's particular genetics, and then make a decision from there. If you're in a high risk area, taking the injectable or the oral preventative might be in your best interest. If you're in a lower risk area, topicals might suit. Figure it out with you, your vet, and the rest of your dog's health team. So how do you check your dog for ticks after you've walked through the woods or yourself. First of all, you're just gonna run your hand across their body. If your dog has a thicker coat, you wanna make sure you get all the way down to the skin. You wanna check the areas of their body that are tighter and warmer than others. So check underneath their armpits, between their toes, in their hip area, up underneath their ears, anywhere that has a nook and cranny that a tick would love to crawl into and attach to your dog. Same thing for yourself. Now, what do you do if you actually find a tick? Well, if you find a tick, the best way to remove it is with a pair of fine tip tweezers. Yep, you heard me right. You're not gonna use a match. You're not gonna use petroleum jelly. You're gonna use a pair of fine tip tweezers. Take the tweezers, grab a hold of the tick's body, and gently pull the tick out. As you start pulling that tick, it will release from the skin, and then you have the tick off your dog or yourself. Once you have the tick removed, go ahead and clean that area with some rubbing alcohol or soap and water. But this is a question I get asked all the time. What if you pull the tick off and the head comes apart and the head is still in your skin? What do you do? First, let's discuss the myth out there. Everyone thinks that if the tick head is stuck in the skin, it's still going to transmit disease. And that is actually not the truth. Did you know that the tick head itself is just a barbed mouthpiece that the tick uses to stay attached to your body? So whenever you detach that body from the tick head and remove the body, you're actually removing the disease and pathogen carrying component. That's the midgut and the saliva glands that pump it back into your body as the tick is feeding. So as long as you get that body off the tick, you're actually good to go. Now, what about this head that's still in your body, the tick head, in your skin or your dog's skin? So since you pulled the body off, you're not at risk for disease transmission. However, your skin is naturally, and your dog's skin, it's naturally turning over every day. So what will happen is it's just gonna slowly push out that tick head and it'll fall out on its own. If you really feel like you need to get that tick head out of there, you can use those fine tip tweezers, grab a hold of it the best you can and slowly pull it out. Now let's say you left that tick head in your dog's skin and a couple days go by and you notice some redness, some swelling, maybe some bumps. Just know that this is just a secondary infection from the tick head being there. It's not actually a disease transmission, but you can, of course, call your vet if you want them to check it out. Quick fact, in case you're trying to remove a tick and you're having trouble with the tweezers, never use matches, lighters, petroleum jelly, dish soap, nail polish, or anything that's going to potentially suffocate the tick. Because if you try to suffocate that tick or touch it with the match from the outside to get it to back itself out, what you're doing is inducing a stress response from the tick. When the tick is stressed out, it's going to immediately get all of its gut contents and pump them out into the host. What that does is increase the host's risk of obtaining a pathogen from that tick. So don't induce that stress response. You won't do that if you're using the tweezer method. Now, one other thing to note is once you remove a tick, don't just crush it, because if you crush a tick, if you get its gut contents all over your fingers, if there's a small abrasion in your skin and the pathogens insert themselves into that small abrasion, you can still get the pathogen just from squeezing the tick. So once you pull the tick off with some tweezers, you can drop it in some alcohol, you can put it on a piece of tape, you can flush it down the toilet, or if you do what I do, I just give it to my chickens or guineas. Make sure you don't crush it to reduce the pathogen risk. Now, if you own some property, here's some quick tools you could utilize to reduce the tick threat on your property. Whether you have a farm, a ranch, you live out in a rural area, or maybe you have some hunting land. First of all, guinea fowl. Guinea fowl are known to hunt out ticks and devour them. Guinea fowl are a poultry type bird. They look kind of like chickens. They operate in a flock that's actually called a confusion. They nest in coops at nighttime if you have them. But what guinea do during the day is they just walk through your land, search out ticks, and destroy them. They're known to range out for a few miles from their coop, so keep that in mind if you decide to employ them on your property. Second of all, chickens. Chickens are great for ticks, fleas, and other small insects. However, chickens aren't gonna range as far as guineas. They are gonna range a couple 100 yards away from their coop, so keep that in mind as you set up a layered defense on your property. Additionally, you'll also want to maintain some of the habitat in your areas. First of all, we know that ticks prefer tall grass and transition zones. So keep your grass mowed short around your house or your high use areas. Remove brush piles or things that ticks could all fester inside of away from your high traffic areas, and definitely away from your dog kennels or dog areas. There are a number of yard and perimeter sprays available out there for tick control and other insects. However, you also need to make sure that if you decide to go this route, that you understand how that spray affects your other animals. If you have chickens or guinea fowl, they are more sensitive to these sprays than other animals. So make sure that if you decide to go with a yard spray, that you know the full impact to all of your living beings that are around around you. Now let's talk real quick about human defense. We've talked a lot about our dogs. We also need to talk about ourselves. We all know about DEET. DEET is out there for the deep woods insect repellents. But what DEET is it's actually a plasticizing agent. You spray it on your body, it's gonna turn some of your fabrics, some of the rubber that's around you. If you're hunting, it's gonna start plasticizing these agents, which is not necessarily a good thing, although it is very effective for insect repellent. There are 2 effective topicals that are proven to work very well for humans. One is picaridin. You can spray this and put it right onto your skin. It's as effective as DEET, non-plasticizing, and will repel the ticks. The other one is permethrin. Remember, we talked about this with our dogs. However, for humans, you would spray this on your socks, on your boots. Don't put it directly on your skin. Now remember what we said about permethrin earlier. If you have cats in your household, this is definitely a no-go. One of the best things about having a dog is giving them the freedom to be a dog. And the best way to do that is with e-collar training for your dog, but you need to do it the right way. And lucky for you, I've taught you everything you need to know about teaching your dog the e-collar in this video right here. So join me in this video, I'll teach you everything I know.